Essential facts about the Vietnam War. The 7-year conflict called the Vietnam War in America and the American War in Vietnam was actually the American phase of the Second Indochina War because it always included the other two former states of French Indochina, Laos and Cambodia, as well as North Vietnam and South Vietnam. It began 6 years before the U.S. entry into the war in 1965, and it continued for 2 years after the withdrawal from the war in 1973. The officially named Republic of Vietnam, that is South Vietnam, and the officially named Democratic Republic of Vietnam, that is North Vietnam, were both sovereign nations, not one nation with two names. Like the two Koreas, North and South, and the two Germanys, East and West, the two Vietnams were each diplomatically recognized as separate sovereign nations. If they were not, then the two Koreas and the two Germanys also were not. At various times and places in South Vietnam, the war had some of the characteristics of a civil war or an insurgency. But by definition, a war between two sovereign nations is not a civil war. And by definition, the invasion of one nation by the armed forces of another nation is not an insurgency. The North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, and their Viet Cong subordinates, the VC, were always directly or indirectly controlled by the political bureau, called the Politburo, of the communist regime in North Vietnam. The grand strategy of the North Vietnamese Politburo was the military conquest of South Vietnam and the establishment of permanent North Vietnamese hegemony in Laos and Cambodia. The North Vietnamese Army had 6 strategic advantages over the South Vietnamese Army. 1. A constant stream of Soviet and Chinese war supplies. 2. Politically protected ports in North Vietnam to receive those supplies. 3. Politically protected routes and base areas in Laos and Cambodia to deliver those supplies to their forces in South Vietnam. 4. No domestic political opposition in their totalitarian police state. 5. No fear of a U.S. strategic expansion of the war into Laos, Cambodia, or North Vietnam after 1968. And 6. A callous willingness to continue incurring huge casualties with increasingly younger North Vietnamese Army soldiers for no permanent military gain. With those 6 advantages, the North Vietnamese Politburo leaders were willing to gamble that their ability to prolong the war militarily was greater than the U.S. president's ability to prolong it politically. The offensive, total war, long-term strategy of the resolute Politburo was superior to the defensive, limited war, short-term strategy of the vacillating U.S. president from 1964 to 1968. The North Vietnamese Politburo leaders knew that they could never defeat the U.S. military's capacity to win large-scale battles, but they believed they eventually could defeat U.S. political will to continue defending South Vietnam. They knew that the key to a long-term strategic victory over the tactically superior U.S. forces was simply surviving long enough to outlast the U.S. forces. They originally identified and consistently exploited the key U.S. strategic vulnerability. It was the inevitable rejection by the U.S. Congress of a lengthy, undeclared, ambiguously defined, indefinitely prolonged, increasingly costly, and apparently unwinnable war in a strategically non-essential country. After 1967, the war was portrayed by the U.S. media, education, and entertainment elites as an unnecessary and incompetent military misadventure of questionable morality and doubtful national security value. From 1959 to 1971, the war was a gradual, incremental invasion of South Vietnam conducted or controlled by the North Vietnamese Army. The first stage of the invasion was the clandestine infiltration into South Vietnam of several thousand communist veterans of the First Indochina War against the French, who moved to North Vietnam from South Vietnam in 1954. In 1959, the North Vietnamese Politburo ordered those people to clandestinely infiltrate back into South Vietnam and join some 10,000 other communist veterans of the First Indochina War, who were ordered by the Politburo to remain in South Vietnam after the war. Together, they began to conduct communist indoctrination of villagers, terrorism against influential non-communist individuals in rural areas and their families, and guerrilla warfare against local government forces. The second stage of the North Vietnamese Army's incremental invasion was the clandestine infiltration of increasingly large units of the regular North Vietnamese Army in 1964 to organize, train, and lead combined North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong forces in semi-conventional mobile warfare against vulnerable South Vietnamese military forces. If the U.S. and its allies had not intervened militarily in 1965 at the request of the South Vietnamese government, the VC and NVA forces would soon have defeated the poorly equipped and poorly led South Vietnamese Army. From 1965 to 1973, U.S. ground forces took every significant enemy position they were ordered to take, defended every significant friendly position they were ordered to defend, and killed more than 10 times as many NVA and VC troops as they lost. In 1968, most of the VC forces were killed or captured by U.S. or South Vietnamese forces in a simultaneous series of nationwide urban battles. The third stage of the North Vietnamese Army invasion of South Vietnam was an overt attack in 1972 by regular Soviet-equipped North Vietnamese Army divisions, using the same conventional tactics that the Communist North Korean Army used in its 1950 invasion of South Korea. The rejuvenated South Vietnamese armed forces alone, supported only by U.S. air power from bases in Thailand and Guam, defeated the North Vietnamese Army's 1972 invasion. The U.S. military could have continued to protect the Republic of Vietnam indefinitely without stationing any U.S. troops there, merely by providing adequate war supplies to the South Vietnamese armed forces and combat air support from bases in Thailand and Guam, as they successfully did in 1972. In 1973 and 74, the U.S. Congress rejected the increasing costs of the constantly escalating and de-escalating war, refused to allocate sufficient funds to provide vital military supplies to the South Vietnamese armed forces, and prohibited U.S. air support to punish the North Vietnamese Army's flagrant 1974 and 1975 violations of the 1973 Paris Peace Accords. In 1975, 300,000 regular troops of the Soviet-equipped North Vietnamese Army, with 500 modern tanks, mechanized long-range artillery, and surface-to-air missiles, invaded South Vietnam again. They conquered it quickly and conventionally, with no concern for civilian hearts and minds, and no need for VC guerrilla fighters. The North Vietnamese conquest of South Vietnam in 1975 was a strategic defeat both for the Republic of Vietnam and for U.S. foreign policy, but it was not a tactical defeat for U.S. military forces in South Vietnam because they had been withdrawn 2 years earlier. The North Vietnamese Army finally won the Second Indochina War because the U.S. gradual attrition tactics limited to South Vietnam did not have any strategic military objective to decisively defeat the main enemy, which was the North Vietnamese Army. Unlike the French in the First Indochina War from 1946 to 1954, the U.S. forces did not fight a strategic 7-year war for Indochina and lose. They fought a 1-year tactical war for South Vietnam 7 times, won it every year for 7 years, and then were withdrawn for U.S. domestic political reasons. After the communist conquests of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in 1975, it was estimated that more people were executed by the communists as class enemies, drowned trying to escape the communist regime by sea, or were slowly killed by starvation, disease, exposure, and exhaustion in communist concentration camps than all the people, military and civilian, who were killed in the actual combat of the war from 1959 to 1975. The widely held but non-factual belief that U.S. forces were defeated in Vietnam by VC guerrillas is as dangerous for world peace as it is for U.S. national interests, because it encourages dictators like Saddam and international terrorists like bin Laden to believe that because the U.S. forces in Vietnam were, quote, defeated by VC guerrillas, end quote, U.S. forces can be defeated by Islamic guerrillas and terrorists. Neither belief is factual, yet wars are being fought today partly because of such non-factual beliefs. The overt and increasingly bitter Cold War in America today between cultural traditionalists and militant leftist progressives is partly an outgrowth of the ideological schism resulting from the leftist anti-war and anti-American protest movements of the mid-1960s and early 1970s. That schism is maintained and institutionalized, whether ignorantly or deliberately, by the distortion and suppression of significant military facts of the Second Indochina War by the left-leaning U.S. media, education, and entertainment establishments. Reliable, objective facts about the military aspects and or the militarily relevant political aspects of the Second Indochina War can be found in at least these 4 books: Philip Davidson's Vietnam at War, Louis Sorley's A Better War, Harry Summers' Historical Atlas of the Vietnam War, and Lien Hung Thi Nguyen's Hanoi's War. No one can properly understand the so-called Vietnam War without a knowledge of the relevant facts explained in those and a few other factually accurate histories of the war's military aspects during its 7-year evolution, as well as its political and diplomatic aspects. Thank you.